morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Michael Kimmage. I'm a professor of history at Catholic University and sort of co-organizer of the Monterey conversations of the kind that we're about to embark on right now. I'm going to go through our introductions very, very quickly because we have two not only very distinguished speakers today, but we have two very busy speakers today who are in the midst of real-time reporting from across Europe and from Ukraine and from Russia. And so we'll cut to the chase, but I could make very long introductions because these are really two very, very accomplished speakers. Anton Troianovski is the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times. Josh Yaffa is a contributing writer at the New Yorker, and I think for anybody who's following the news, the serious news on Russia and Ukraine, these are going to be very familiar names and very familiar bylines. So, I'm going to jump right in with a couple of questions. I'll say to the audience that you should be ready with your questions. You can send them in whenever you wish to the Q&A function, preferably that to the chat function, but we would see it in the chat function as well. And roughly 11:45 Eastern time, we'll be switching from a conversation among the three of us to an open conversation with questions very much welcome from our audience. The first question I have for you, Anton and Josh, and we'll start with Anton and then go to Josh, is about the 24th of February, and just that day in your life, the impressions that you took in, sort of where you were physically at the moment that this war began, and some of the emotions, perhaps the nature of the shock, the things that most surprised you on that terrible day. If we go back to that, sort of begin our story at that moment. Anton, let's start with you and go over to Josh in a moment.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Michael. I remember it, of course, very well, and it doesn't even seem like a specific day in retrospect because February 23rd went directly into February 24th, obviously with next to no sleep for a lot of people, and we were, of course, all anticipating that something would happen overnight after Putin gave or after the Russian parliament approved that request for assistance from the so-called People's Republics in the Donbass. So I was in the New York Times offices in Sadova-Samotechная Street in central Moscow, the place where the New York Times has had its offices for decades. And as Putin was giving his speech, of course, there was the immediate need to get it to our audience on the website and get the news out in time for the print edition to close, which I think we did. And then February 24th was trying to understand the situation in Russia. It was a war had begun, but obviously Russian state media wasn't calling it a war or describing it as a war. And so in many ways, what was happening on the street was life was continuing. People were back at the same coffee shops and shopping malls and restaurants. The only real kind of indication of something being terribly wrong that you saw was the lines at ATMs as people tried to get hard currency out of their bank accounts. But it was a day that of course I'll never forget for both the gravity of what happened and the way that it really did not register for so many people around me in Moscow.
Thank you so much, Anton. Josh, that day in your memory, what was it like?
So I was in Kramatorsk in eastern Ukraine in Donbass. I had gone there because, as Anton alluded to, in the days before the invasion, we saw Putin make a series of increasingly kind of bellicose speeches about Ukraine and also ask and receive authorization to use military force from the upper house of parliament. And it was clear something was brewing. I mean, it had been clear for weeks, if not months, but it was clear something was coming to a head militarily. But many people thought, myself included, that that might start in a more localized way in the Donbass, where this war sparked and fueled by Russia had been going on for 8 years. And the idea was that if a new war were to begin, that it would begin there and spread outward. Of course, nothing of the sort happened. You know, we saw a wide war launched along several fronts with multiple axes of advance from the very beginning. But I was in Kramatorsk thinking that perhaps that's where the local escalation might begin. And I was in my bed in Kramatorsk at 5 a.m. when the city began to be, was hit by cruise missile strikes that hit a military command post in town and a weapons depot, and the windows rumbled and the ground shook, and you know, the air echoed with explosions in ways that many people across Ukraine have come to, if not exactly become accustomed to, have become, sadly, you know, no kind of strange or outlying occurrence to Ukraine in the months that have followed. But certainly at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 24th, it was nonetheless quite a shock. A shock, even though I and sort of we writ large, journalists who cover Russia and Ukraine, Ukrainians, had been somehow preparing for such an event. Of course, it's a hard thing to actually prepare for fully, right? To be bombed. And so even though it was, I guess I put it in that category of not surprising but shocking events, and that's how I felt in those first few moments of shock, but also a sense of purpose, mission, not to be too kind of grandiose or cliche about it, right? And certainly not to emphasize or overemphasize my own role, which is rather minuscule. But still, it felt like once that initial bombardment passed, and it was all of 10 minutes, and I went to the basement with photographer who I was working with, Emanuele Sattoli, a very talented Italian photographer. After that first wave passed, it was then, okay, you know, we need to figure out a way to work. We need to figure out a way to cover this. We need to figure out a way to be on top of this story and follow it where it goes. And from dawn, an hour or so later, we were out in the streets of Kramatorsk, trying to understand how Ukraine as a country and how Ukrainians as individuals in a society would respond to what was already then clear a wide-scale invasion. In other words, you know, from that basement where we went after the first strikes, we could see by tracking the news on our phones that dozens of Ukrainian cities had been hit, that tanks were streaming across the border from the north, from Belarus, from the south, from Crimea, the east, toward Kharkiv, and it was clear this was going to be a wide-scale invasion, and that gave us a sense of, again, not to make it sound too cliche or self-aggrandizing, a sense of purpose and a sense of mission, that okay, we're safe, and so it's time to get to work.
Well, those already are a very vivid and contrasting set of images. The shopping malls of Moscow still full, people going to ATM machines, you know, sort of preemptively because they sense, you know, economic difficulties in Russia itself. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Josh, the sort of earth-shattering nature of the assault, the tactile terror that everybody must have felt, yourself included, in the orbit of that war as it began on the 24th of February. It's already a very helpful set of contrasting images. I want to turn now to a question that's a little bit less maybe emotional in nature or image-driven in nature, but very important for us as readers of your work and of the work of your colleagues to try to understand this war, place it in context, understand also the nature of the information that we're receiving, analysis, narrative, and storytelling as well. And this is the very changed set of circumstances for you two as individuals, but for many journalists covering Russia, flowing from the March 4th censorship law that has made reporting both different and immensely more difficult since the war began. So let me start first with Josh and then turn to Anton in this regard to reflect on the nature of these changes and maybe, if you can, sort of on the fly, to help us as readers to understand the new journalistic world that we're living in caused by the war.
I mean, I think that we're living in an entirely new journalistic world, but not in some exclusive way or a way that's unique to journalism. We're just living in a different world as concerns Russia, and certainly kind of Russian, the dynamics inside Russia, what it's like to live and work in Russia have changed in dramatic ways for journalists, but not only for journalists, right? Journalists are just part of a general story. I think that I'm curious to hear how Anton reflects on this, but I do think, we can fairly talk about a pre and post February 24th world inside Russia in terms of politics and society, and journalists are perhaps to a degree more than other professions and categories, but certainly not exclusively, have been affected by those changes, and those changes have been very much aggressively in the direction of consolidation, further state control, that have made reporting difficult, if not impossible, first and foremost for Russian organizations who quite tenaciously and in some cases really heroically were holding on to the very end and managing to do independent reporting in Russia all the way up until February 23rd, whether it's television channels like Dozhd, websites like Media Zona or the BBC Russian service, all of which have done really important work and continue to do important work. But the series of laws, including the March 4th censorship law, but also the continuing use of the foreign agent designation and a number of kind of legalistic tools that the Russian government, I think it's fair to say, just uses as means of repression of free speech or repression of free reporting and dissemination of information, have made that really impossible. And you saw first and foremost Russian journalists scatter under fear, I think, very real and acute fear of criminal prosecution. And with the closing of Novaya Gazeta, whose editor-in-chief Dmitry Muratov won the Nobel Prize this year, which, technically speaking, and this is also perhaps worth noting, just to understand how actually censorship and control of information works in Russia, Novaya Gazeta itself made the decision to close. It had received 2 warnings for breaking, Anton can correct me here, I think some combination of foreign agent laws and the wartime censorship laws, but in any case, the very real fear is that on the 3rd such violation, the institution, the media outlet can be closed with serious legal implications for its publishers and staff. And so Novaya Gazeta took the preemptive decision, I guess you could call it, but the forced preemptive decision to close. But with the closing of Novaya Gazeta, I think it's fair to say that whatever kind of delicate and already fraught media landscape or landscape for independent media in Russia before the war all but disappeared entirely. And that is a new environment for Russia, to go from one where independent voices are pressured to one where independent voices do not exist. And really, most Russians, unless you are really motivated and really savvy to, say, install and use a VPN, there are no alternative or independent sources of information about the war. And I think that's super telling. That has a really big impact on Russian public perceptions about the war. And we can talk about the interplay between those 2 inputs and outputs, and if it's even really possible to measure or talk in any certainty about Russian public attitudes to the war. Is that even a knowable? Is that even something we can know with any degree of certainty these days? I'm maybe actually a bit doubtful about that. As for me, in sort of summation, my involvement is, I think, the least interesting part, as opposed to some of the larger processes. I've spent most of my time actually in Ukraine since February 24th. I've stayed in Ukraine after the start of the war until mid-March, and I left, and then I have gone back for 2 extended reporting trips, the last of which ended at the beginning of the month. I was most recently in Donbass in eastern Ukraine. We can talk a bit about how the war has become much more sort of localized along that front, and Russia seems to be making more gains on that front if we talk in terms of pure sort of territorial acquisitions. But I've directed a lot of my, really almost the majority, or almost the entirety of my reporting efforts at Ukraine these past months, and I've kept an eye on Russia, and I've written some shorter pieces about Russia, and certainly kept up communication with either sources, contacts, people I'm interested in Russia, and sort of monitor and follow the scene there, though Anton can speak to that with much more specificity because he's been writing on Russia these past months. But I felt like, both because of the sort of visceral urgency of the situation in Ukraine and the access to Ukraine, I mean, that's a place, despite the logistical difficulties, I could get to, and I wasn't myself going back to Russia after the start of the war. I felt like the best use of my sort of limited repertorial energies was better spent in Ukraine, at least in the early weeks and months of the war. And that indeed is where most of my journalistic output has come from since February 24th.
Thank you so much, Josh. Anton, the New York Times Moscow bureau has itself been a bit of a story during the war, and very curious to get your reflections on how you've managed your office and reporting since the war has begun.
You said in your original question that this was perhaps less of an emotional topic, but certainly it is in many ways an emotional topic for us. Our mission in the Moscow bureau of the New York Times and all my colleagues in Moscow is to write about Russia and tell readers around the world about what is happening there. And to suddenly have to do that in a situation where you can't be in the country is extraordinarily difficult and something we try to find optimal ways to deal with, but will always be nothing like being in the country physically. So indeed, you mentioned the March 4th censorship law. That was something that introduced punishments of up to 15 years in prison for disseminating information not in line with the official Russian government line. So we decided, and other colleagues at other publications also decided to leave the country temporarily and do our best covering Russia from outside the country while we tried to assess how to safely report from inside the country going forward. And we're still in that process of assessing the situation. So we're still in this situation where we are doing our reporting on Russia from outside the country. It's something that you can do. Last year I wrote an article about a new generation of Russian exiles, because actually 2021 was a year in which more Russian activists and journalists got pushed out of the country than at any point since the fall of the Soviet Union. And I interviewed Mikhail Jorkovsky, who told me that, he hasn't set foot as a free man on Russian soil since 2003, and he's been abroad since 2013 when he was released from prison. And what he told me was, I spent 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, immersing myself in what's going on in Russia, whether it's through the internet or being on the phone with people. And that's how he, by being super disciplined, he's able to remain part of the conversation in Russia and retain some influence there, at least on public life. And so that's what we try to do as well. Talk on the phone with people as much as we can, be on top of both the state media conversation, the online conversation. That's what we try to do. But, in terms of what transpired in these last months, I think the other moment that I'll never forget is arriving in Istanbul in early March. There was a crazy blizzard. They said it was the worst snowstorm in Istanbul since 1987. And that was the weekend that tens of thousands of Russians arrived. And just those, seeing those dressed Russian activists and journalists and IT workers wandering the slippery, snowed-in streets of Istanbul, kind of just with this shock in their faces that you could see from across the block, that was just an extraordinary and really kind of wrenching sight.
Thank you so much thanks so much to both of you for the images and for the answers. Let's turn now to a somewhat different set of questions, a little bit less about journalism per se, and more about the issues that are, in a sense, before all of us. And I want to turn now to the war itself, and I'll start with Anton, ask you slightly different questions about the war in Ukraine. Anton, you've covered in the last couple of weeks quite a few stories related to Ukraine and the European Union, what one could describe as sort of Ukraine and the high politics of the war. And I just wanted to ask about, sort of covering those stories, how you try to do it, what you see as the important trend lines, maybe certain issues on the horizon. Obviously, we have the G7 meeting sort of behind us and the Madrid summit coming up, and there'll be many more such gatherings. But I'm curious to get your thoughts about how you try to contextualize Ukraine now in really a global set of questions that are swirling around this country.
I certainly am trying to do my best to get inside the conversation in Russia, which is, as we were just discussing, an increasingly difficult thing to do. But I think the bottom line is when it comes to Ukraine, amid all of these political discussions, it's been notable to see, for instance, how blasé the Russian reaction has been to Ukraine getting EU candidate status. And the reason is that clearly the ambitions for making progress on the battlefield have by no means been fulfilled in the Kremlin. There's more territory they're planning to take, and so I think the fact of the matter is, and here's where I very much understand Josh's perspective of wanting to focus on what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine, because really that is the biggest thing that matters here. It's what happens on the battlefield. That's, I think, why you're seeing the Russian response to things like the current Lithuania situation, the Sweden, Finland joining NATO, Ukraine getting EU candidacy status. Why all those things, the reaction out of the Kremlin has been really quite slow in coming and fairly subdued, at least in terms of the actions that they've taken. And again, I think the reason is that the focus is on the battlefield, and everything else flows out of that.
And Josh, it's a nice segue to asking Josh a version of this question. Everything fundamental is happening at the moment on the battlefield. I'm just thinking of the sort of locations that you've been reporting from and writing about in the last 3-4 months. Very shortly after the war, February 26th, war comes to Kiev, and then reporting from Novi Bikiv, from Chernihiv, from Melitopol, and then most recently from Eastern Ukraine. So none of these pieces are about everything that's going on in Ukraine. They're all about localized particular realities. Many of them have focused on war crimes and atrocities. And so I just wanted to ask you about, first of all, covering these local areas. How do you choose? How do you, also Chernihiv, I didn't mention, you have a piece from there or about the city of Chernihiv, how you choose these locations and how you try to tell the larger story of the war through these very granular portraits of local realities.
Well, in the beginning, and by that I mean first weeks, let's say, of the war, it didn't feel like much of a choice. The situation was really chaotic, was really fraught in Kiev those days. If we're talking about kind of early and mid-March, this was when Russian forces were outside the city in multiple directions, very much still trying to penetrate Kiev, presumably to seize the capital in some form. And being inside Kiev was very stressful. Kiev was being actively attacked and struck with bombs and missile attacks. And again, there were this ring of Russian troops in the perimeter. And so I frankly didn't feel like I was making a whole lot of really informed or sort of purposeful journalistic choices. I felt like I was doing the sort of journalism that was available to me. And frankly, those days, it felt like you could walk out your door and get a story. I mean, anything that was happening in Kiev or almost anywhere across Ukraine was interesting. The reader interest was absolutely, almost overwhelming, right? How much people wanted to know about Ukraine, certainly more than you felt like as a journalist you could actually deliver. And everything felt both extremely uncertain and chaotic, but also just high stakes. And it almost didn't matter. Well, you didn't really have the ability to kind of pick and choose your stories, the logistics of getting around were too complicated and certainly felt in some ways unsafe, or at least just uncertain. But also it didn't matter. The story was kind of everywhere at once, and almost anyone you talked to had a story to tell you, and almost any observation or encounter you had felt important and revelatory in some way. And so those early weeks were less about picking stories and more about just trying to leave the hotel and get lucky. And with time, that's when the nature of the war changed. Certainly, the big shift happened in late March, early April, when Russian forces, really it was by early April, when Russian forces withdrew from the Kiev region, but also around Chernihiv, also around the city of Kharkiv. The battles around Kharkiv, of course, continue. But then that was a kind of breather, at least just in terms of immediate safety and logistics, say in the Kiev area, when you could start to make some more targeted choices. But for example, that story from Novy Bykov, where I ended up learning absolutely kind of horrific story about a cellar in town that Russian forces had used during their occupation of the village, where they kept local prisoners. And one night, in fact, the last night before Russian troops pulled out, they came into that cellar and demanded for 4 volunteers to be shot, and indeed led 4 men into the night who were later found dead. That story I came across entirely accidentally. In the days after Russian troop withdrawal from the Kiev region, we had heard about Bucha, or at least the sort of early indications that indeed there had been mass atrocities in Bucha, also in places like Irpin. Novy Bykov was on the other side of the Dnieper River. It's actually in the Chernihiv Oblast, but still in this sort of ring of cities around Kiev. And I went there with another journalist, actually, Sean Walker from The Guardian, and we were on essentially a kind of expedition to find what we could, but without having any real target or idea ahead of time of what we would find. And we came to Novy Bykov, started talking with locals, heard about the cellar, the small village, then found one person who was held in the cellar and ultimately escaped or left, was able to leave the cellar when the Russian troops left the village, and then found another person, and so on until we heard the story and had it confirmed by 4 different people, the story about the 4 men being taken out to be shot. But that was not something I went into knowing about, certainly the cellar, or knowing even why I wanted to be in Novy Bykov. It was just a drive around the Kiev, the countryside around Kiev, to see what we could find. And I think the most terrifying aspect of that story, or the darkest, is that stories like that happened all over the place, right? This is not a story of just Bucha and then randomly Novy Bykov. And further drives around the countryside in this ring of cities around Kiev, or villages around Kiev, I went to a number, Gribelki, Velika Demirovka, where stories of random killings, extrajudicial executions, certainly detentions by Russian troops abound. And I think that was the most sort of terrifying realization, in that we made a left turn, so to speak, into Novy Bykov and found the story of the cellar, but we could have made a right turn to go into another village. And my sense, having been in a lot of these villages now, is that these sorts of atrocities and horrors happened everywhere. By the time things came to my last trip in late May and early June, the war had really localized, at least the active fighting along the Donbass front. Of course, as we saw yesterday in this missile attack on a shopping mall, and a missile attack on Kiev residential area the day before that, Russia continues to strike at other cities across Ukraine. But the active fighting, the artillery war, the move to seize territory is happening in Donbass. And so that was something that felt like an obvious reporting target, something I could plan for and make some decisions for myself about what were the kinds of things I wanted to get out of that story, right? I wanted to get a sense of the fight from the Ukrainian side, so I needed to speak to some Ukrainian military units and soldiers involved in that fight. I certainly wanted to focus on the role of Western artillery and heavy weaponry in that fight. That's something Ukrainians on all levels, whether you're talking to top officials in Kiev or people, soldiers in the trenches in eastern Ukraine, all of them emphasize the urgent need for Western heavy weaponry, and that certainly more of it and faster and in larger quantities. And I wanted to understand the role that weaponry plays and why it's so important. And so I was able to, prioritize trying to find an artillery unit that is employing this foreign, in the particular case of the artillery unit I spoke to, Western or American-made howitzers. This also covered, it was a nice story in the New York Times, spending a day with this, not the same, but a similar howitzer crew with the 777 howitzers, as they're called. So I had some ideas about, characters and scenes and aspects of the story I needed, or thought I needed to write a portrait of the war in the Donbass in that moment. And the sum of it is basically the point of why I'm describing this or telling this sort of trip by trip narration is that as the war has progressed and as its geography has settled into place, and as I think both readers, but also Ukrainians, Russians, whether civilians or their respective militaries, have kind of settled into this war, they've become used to it in a way, right? So that sense of shock has worn off for everybody, including I think for readers back home. And so you're able to make some different choices, both because of the more focused geography of the war, but also the kind of atmospherics around the war, both for its participants and those reading about it, that you can slow down a bit and make more targeted choices about the stories you want to take on, and then think through how do you want to actually go about reporting those stories. And I feel like I'm able to work a little bit more in the way that I'm used to, rather than simply kind of responding to a chaotic and scary and dangerous situation and trying to sort of exist to the extent possible within it.
I'm glad to see that there are questions trickling into the Q&A, and I'll just encourage our audience to send in as many as come to mind, and we'll turn to your questions not too far from now. I'm going to start with you, Josh, and then go to Anton with a question, in this case, not about Ukraine, but about Russia. And it's clear from what you said earlier about new limitations and not being in Russia itself that this has gotten harder. But surely not impossible to report on questions in Russia that don't concern high politics. And Josh, I remember a conversation about your book, Between Two Fires in Washington, D.C., where you talked about all of the efforts that you made in the prep for that book to go out to the regions, to capture different dimensions of Russian life and not to stay only in Moscow. Clearly, to the extent that we outside of Russia can understand Russian public opinion and issues in culture, politics, economics that are affecting everyday Russians, this is a very important part of the present moment. It's a very important thing to try to understand. So I just wanted to ask you, starting with you, Josh, and I'll ask you, Anton, the same question in a moment. How can one do this? You have a piece in the New Yorker, Josh, about support for the war in Russia. I know that your work is maybe more concentrated at the moment on Ukraine, but I'm sure you'll be going back and forth between the two countries. What are your instincts in terms of how one can best get this story out, given the obvious limitations?
It's a question I've wrestled with and don't have a good answer. Why are there not wider anti-war protests? Or why is there not a wider anti-war movement in Russia? Is that because Russians support the war? Is that because Russians are kind of indifferent to the war, right? They neither support it, but nor are they particularly bothered by it. And so they continue this mode of disengagement and apathy that we've seen to a large degree kind of define or direct Russian politics in previous years? Or are people simply afraid for completely understandable reasons that I'm not sure you or I would necessarily respond with all that much more almost self-injurious bravery when we're talking about facing the prison terms of the kind Anton laid out, 15 years for dissemination of quote unquote false information about activity of Russian armed forces, but sort of down the line. Certainly if you got to something like organizing and participating in an unsanctioned protest in wartime, that has really serious effects and carries really serious dangers. And so perhaps it's that people are simply too scared, and understandably so, to act. But I don't know the answer to that, right? This really important question, which is, we don't see huge, massive, large-scale, nationwide resistance to the war. Why is that? And understanding that question, I think, has a lot of implications, right? Not just for those of us who have a professional and personal interest in understanding Russia, but I think it has real policy implications for outside powers trying to understand how to deal with Russia in this war and trying to bring the war to a close, and trying to confront Russia in its expansionist imperial ambitions. Understanding what the Russian people think, has real import there. But I just don't know myself what the answer is. And that's the sort of thing that you do, frankly, lose by not being there. That just kind of tactile, what's the mood on the street. I was always skeptical of this idea of like just somehow picking up the mood by some strange osmosis in on the metro and in cafes. I always thought that was a kind of silly notion. If I'm not like actively reporting, I thought journalism is something you do when you take out a notebook or pull out a voice recorder and start asking someone questions. But I think there actually is much more than I ever put stock into the idea that you do learn a lot by just being there and just overhearing things and somehow with time picking up on the mood in bits and pieces, and that's what we're lacking now, and it makes it really difficult to draw that sort of the kind of tactile, nuanced, sensitive portrait of Russia that I hope I was able to achieve to some degree with my book. But as you mentioned, not by no lack of effort, right? I mean, that took really flying around, that took visiting the regions, that took sort of embedding myself in people's lives, not just in Moscow, but in Perm in Siberia, in Pskov in the West, in the Caucasus and Chechnya. And that's the kind of work that I'm not doing right now. And it gives me a lot less confidence to talk about, this is the kind of opinion or the mood in Russia, right? What do Russians think about the war? I don't know. I mean, that ultimately was the main takeaway of that piece I wrote for the New Yorker, having not just marinated in my own thoughts, but actually talking to sociologists and pollsters and political scientists. It seemed to me like the consensus from them was, the only thing we can say with certainty is that we don't know anything with certainty. And I think that was, I'm paraphrasing one quote from someone who tried to do polling around the war, where of course, these days, the most common, I mean, I think, 80%, 90% of those you try and ask to take a survey about the war, the most common answer is declining to participate. In other words, before you even get to asking people about what they think about the war, you're dealing with 80 or 90% rejection rate of participating in the survey at all. So what can you even then say about that 10% that agrees to answer your questions? Clearly, there's a lot of filtering and perhaps self-censorship going on before you even get to ask your question. So I think that's just yet another reason why we're really in the dark about what's happening in Russia. There's a phenomenon I've taken an interest in because it's very curious. We know little about is like for example, sabotage of rail lines, that connecting railway lines to arms depots and weapons production facilities, or the arson of military recruitment offices across Russia. I mean, again, we can't talk about a sort of massive nationwide underground resistance movement, but somebody around the country is doing these things. Who are they? How are they connected? What are their goals? And are they part of a movement or not? And at what point can we actually declare them a movement, even if they're acting as individuals? Like, that's also, I have no idea, right? And so there's definitely way more very intriguing and very important mystery surrounding the idea of Russian public opinion than there is any sense that I can with confidence tell you what's going on there.
I think in DC, when it comes to Russian public opinion, there have been two surprises. One is that there's not more anti-war sentiment, and the other is that the sanctions don't seem to have had the effect that the Biden administration perhaps promised, or that was expected. So I think the DC policy community needs, as always, just sharper, better information on things that are going on inside of Russia, because there have been some pretty significant misjudgments since the start of the war. That's a topic for another day. I would like to turn to Anton now. You had a piece on McDonald's in the Times that takes one outside of the walls of the Kremlin, and the New York Times appended to that a very interesting video about, I think, or I hope I'm not confusing two storylines, but the kind of a new version of McDonald's that was established in Russia. And then you mentioned being on the phone with people in Russia as one source of information. You also mentioned tracking the non-official sort of world of the internet, which is, to be sure, not a new dynamic of 2022, but wouldn't have been something that journalists would have had access to during the Cold War. So in some respects, I'm sure you have a profusion of information and sources. It's not that there's a lack of information, but I'm very curious how you get at that story of public opinion, the regions, different social classes, that huge world of Russia outside the Kremlin gates.
Well, I'll say a few things. The first thing, when it comes to the craft of journalism, Josh very eloquently in his prior answer described how he was getting those stories in Ukraine, and that it was about taking a left turn versus a right turn into a village, and you come upon a story. That is kind of how we are taught, I think, as journalists to do our job. That a lot of times it's just about showing up, as they say, being in the right place at the right time. This has not been possible for covering Russia, right? That serendipity of walking out the door or flying to a city because you have a hunch that there's going to be a good story there. You got one meeting, so you're just going to go and then see what comes out of that meeting. You can't do that now. So what I think we've been trying to do in our minds now as journalists covering Russia from outside the country has been to recreate those moments of serendipity somehow digitally or by contacting people remotely. So for instance, it means just putting out perhaps a lot more interview requests than you normally would, just doing a lot more brainstorming of like, oh, who would be interesting to talk to? Who's a very long shot? He's 99% not going to talk to you, but it's worth a try. I remember in my case, one of those people that I tried on a whim was Oleg Tinkov, the billionaire founder of Tinkoff Bank, who I'd never spoken to before, but I got his number and I texted him. And then a month later, he called me back and said, I can talk to you right now, not any other time. And I talked to him, and it was a really, I think, insightful interview that we published with him. So that in terms of the craft of journalism, you have to be creative, but you just, at the same time, the fact remains, as with journalism anytime and anywhere, you just have to talk to a lot of people, and you have to be really open-minded about the kinds of people you want to hear from and the questions that you ask, with also, of course, the added layer of the fact that Russia is a much more repressive society than it's ever been in the post-Soviet era. So you also always have to keep in mind of the risk you're putting onto those you talk to, and making extremely sure that folks who are talking to you understand the risks for them. So in terms of Russian public opinion and polling, the polling number that fascinates me the most is the percentage of people who say they're not paying attention to what's happening in Ukraine. That is up to, I just pulled it up here, 43%, according to Levada, as of May 2022. So as of last month, according to this famous independent Russian polling agency, 43% of Russians are not following what's happening in Ukraine. So I think that's really key to understanding what's going on inside the country, is that for many, many people, life has really not changed, or the extent to which it's changed, it's not something that they attribute to what's going on in Ukraine. And even if they do attribute it to what's going on in Ukraine, they don't exactly understand what's going on in Ukraine. So those multiple information filters, and the filters of different people's lived experiences that are just so incredibly diverse across Russia, you really have to keep in mind. And then, a final point I would make about that I've been thinking about a lot is, yes, it was fantastic to be a reporter. It is fantastic to be a reporter in Russia, and the Times. One of the things that's been great about it, as I hope readers have seen, is how much resources the paper is willing to devote to quality photography and quality reporting, from not just from Moscow but from across the country. So my colleagues and I have really had the wonderful chance to travel really all across and talk to people from the Coral Islands to Kaliningrad, to the Arctic, to the Caucasus. But there's the question of what did we miss? I think it's in a way similar to the conversation that colleagues in the US were having after the election of Donald Trump in 2016. We, I think, did not recognize just how powerful television propaganda continued to be, even in a world where the internet is free, where social media is on the rise. Even now, television is by far the most influential information medium in Russia. And the way it's that television working with the context, the social context and political context of Russia is able to sway people's minds is really extraordinary. So I think we as journalists just have to continue to have an open mind and try to be creative in how we understand and what we do to learn about what's happening in the country. And as Josh said, it's an extremely hard thing to do.
Anton, I want to start this question with you, and I'm going to break it into two pieces to sort of conclude it with a question about Russian government and Putin and decision making, which is, of course, in some respects, the primary question when it comes to the war, and so perhaps a good place for us to end this part of the conversation. But I want to start with Putin himself. You had a piece on Putin likening himself to Peter the Great, or putting himself in that imperial Russian tradition. Then you've tracked a couple of the speeches at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum and elsewhere, and no doubt have been tracking Putin's speeches for the last 12 months, which is an important subject. My question is a difficult one to answer, but I still want to ask it. Is this the culmination of a long tendency in Putin's politics vis-a-vis Ukraine, sort of military ventures, thinking about the West? Is this the culmination, or has a kind of new Putin emerged for personal reasons or for political reasons, such that the last 12 months seem to you exceptional and unusual? I'm sure they do to some degree, but I guess the question is, to what degree has the Putin story really changed over the course of the last 12 months?
Well, I think it's both. I don't think it's the culmination in the sense that he's going to fight this war and that's it. But I do think it's a culmination because so many things in retrospect have really led up to this moment. I really sort of was thinking about that a lot in the winter before the war, when, as you recall, officials in Washington were saying that an invasion is a near certainty, and analysts and really everyone in Moscow was saying, no, it wouldn't make any sense. And one of the things that people were pointing to for why there was no imminent invasion is that it didn't feel like the television propaganda had markedly changed. It didn't feel like they were suddenly pounding the war drum on Channel 1 and on Russia. And so I was thinking about that. And then I realized, well, actually, they've been preparing society for war for years, and that, I think, is the other thing that we maybe didn't kind of sufficiently realize the importance of in Russia and in Putin's domestic policy, is the way that militarization of society that we saw and that we kind of always assumed was, well, generally just about his getting his political standing sewed up, that it really literally was preparing people for war. So I think in many ways the invasion was preceded by a lot more than 12 months of preparing society. We can talk about the failures in actually preparing the military for war. Another thing that we surely won't fully understand for a long time is what actually happened in those 2 years of isolation that Putin put himself in during the pandemic and really continues to exist in. And then the third thing, though, is going forward, we really have to, I think, assume that Putin continues, that there really isn't any solid reporting or evidence, for example, that he's sick, as you read in some outlets. And so in that sense, this isn't a culmination, because there's a lot more that could happen after this. And again, as I said in my prior answer, the main lesson I take away from all of this as a journalist is the importance of keeping an open mind and understanding that really anything can happen.
Josh, you recently wrote on Twitter, if memory serves me correctly, in regard to the story about Russian destruction of ammunition depots, in Europe, which has become a real issue for Ukraine in terms of its access to the Soviet era ammunition, that a certain kind of narrative or storyline fell into place for you when you saw that wasn't visible to you a year or two ago when some of these sort of local episodes were happening. So I just want to ask you, in a sense, the same question that I just asked Anton about what has fallen into place for you in terms of the Putin story, the Putin narrative, what has become clear, and what emphases do you think are the most important ones to strike at the moment?
Echoing Anton, I don't think that this war was inevitable in the sense that it was not predetermined on New Year's Eve 1999 when Putin took over from Yeltsin, right? It was not as if this whole time there was something kind of baked into Putin's personhood, let alone his, I don't know, DNA that made him destined to launch a war against Ukraine. And I think this war, up until quite recently, perhaps was avoidable or was not predetermined. Perhaps indeed, as Anton said, these 2 years of COVID isolation is actually when some of Putin's more kind of the darker, more sort of conspiratorial strain of thinking of Putin. I mean, it was always there, certainly, right? But really, maybe perhaps became dominant. We saw that in this speech. I think that maybe among the more kind of historical documents, at least in this moment of this war, actually came before the war on February 21st, I believe, this long speech that Putin gave more than an hour, and Anton maybe remember with more precision, but at which he sort of really unspooled all of his kind of dark conspiratorial reading of Ukraine's history, or sort of lack of history as a kind of non-nation, right? Without claim to historical legitimacy. And I think that some of those ideas that were necessary, in addition to all of Putin's more longstanding beliefs about Russia being unfairly treated by the West, about NATO as a threat, about the NATO threat for Russia and Russia's backyard, its regional and global security interests, all of that existed for a long time, but I think it needed this additional catalyst of Putin settling on this conspiratorial reading of Ukraine's history, or sort of lack of history, to make this war possible. And that was something that I'm not sure existed in 2008 at the time of, say, the Munich 2007, the time of the Munich speech, in which he declared his foreign policy ambitions vis-a-vis the West. So this is a sort of muddled way of saying, of course, a lot of the necessary component parts of what led Putin to invade existed and sort of circulating in his mind for a long time. But I think that that the ultimate kind of drive toward war clicked into place relatively recently in his 22-year reign, and the Putin of 2007 in Munich wasn't necessarily, inevitably destined to invade Ukraine, at least not in the way we've seen. Now, maybe I'll stop there. I forgot if there's a second part of the question, but why don't I'll just end it there, and we can move to other people's questions and continue.
I have one final question for you, Josh, which I'm going to spin around and ask in a similar form to Anton, and then we have several interesting questions from the audience. I'm not crazy about the word regime. I tend to, we have a government, other people have regimes. I think there can be a distortion that enters in with that word, but I'll ask you a question, Josh, about the the Russian regime, since you've written so helpfully and so insightfully about the nature of support that Russians gave to the Putin system. This is, of course, in your 2020 book, Between Two Fires. I'm curious how you conceptualize that now, to the best of your ability. We're working off of very incomplete information, the kind of stability that it has, which seems to be pretty significant, the nature of the support, the kind of internal dynamic, power dynamic that exists at the present moment in Russia. Clearly, much changed in the last 2 years, but I think also probably with certain continuities to the wily society that you described circa 2020.
Right. So the book Between Two Fires is essentially kind of portrait of Russia through the prism of compromise and the compromises that individuals either feel compelled to make or through some sort of quest for ambition or power or wealth choose to make, or under threat, under fear choose to make. But I think for whatever reasons people end up compromising with, I think the regime is a fair word to use here. That those dynamics have stayed the same, right? The sort of nature or mechanics of compromise in Russia have not changed. The stakes have increased on all sides, right? The price you pay for refusing compromise has gone up. Also, and I wrote about this already at the time in the book, but it's only intensified. This kind of liminal space, this almost private space that people have, the space that people have for compromise, right? Where they can eke out a bit of themselves, find space for themselves and their own ambitions and even values, but not engage in direct confrontation with the state. That free zone, sort of, I don't know, a kind of moral DMZ, in which a person can kind of be a bit of both, or kind of not give up or reject his or her own values or ambitions, but also not into confrontation with the state, has really shrunk. And it had already shrunk at the time I wrote my book, right? The Russia, the landscape in 2007, 2008, 2010, all the way 2014 really was a very different one, in which there was much more room for people to maybe exist at the margins, as the better image or metaphor, right? Or maybe even better is to kind of describe Putin as some kind of big tent, right? In which for a while you could be a neo-Stalinist and an Orthodox priest and even a Gulag historian, right? If you did your kind of Gulag research within certain parameters, all of those people found a place for themselves in the Putin system writ large. And the Putin system, by being non-ideological, it demanded or puts up certain barriers in terms of political loyalty and obedience, but didn't really demand all that much in terms of loyalty. It was not about mobilization, right? It actually encouraged passivity. And the war doesn't necessarily, overnight disrupt or kind of fundamentally change the nature of the Putin system. It just intensifies processes that had already begun and limits that space for sort of quasi-freedom that is so important in this dynamic of compromise that I described in the book. It really demands a new level of loyalty. For example, someone like Konstantin Ernst, the head of Channel 1, Russia's main state-run television channel, he's someone I think about a lot. And the compromise, the extent I diagnosed it, he, I think, would articulate it for himself differently. But, the creative free rein he was given as head of that channel in exchange for running the channel as a very reliable, dependable propaganda resource. The nature of that bargain changed over the years, and it's certainly changed in a dramatic way since February 24th. And I think that's emblematic of how, like I said, the mechanics of compromise have changed the same, but the stakes have really gone up. But I also think we've learned, and this is a question about sanctions efficacy, that people aren't able to so readily jettison or reject the system, that either the system still has too much it can offer them, or rather too much with which it can threaten people, right? The stick, maybe the carrot has decreased in size because of sanctions and general shrinking of the economy, but the stick has only grown as Russia has increased the reach of its repressive apparatus. And so there's a real cost for those who would reject the system. But I think, in short, there has not been a breakdown of this system of compromise and kind of wiliness that I write about in the book, but rather its intensification. And that didn't necessarily surprise me, but I frankly did expect more, and we have seen some, but I expected even more people to kind of break with or somehow reject the system and this whole complicated dance of compromise. But we've seen far more people try and adapt themselves to this new reality than reject it.
I mean, there was a very interesting statement from the director of the Hermitage in the last couple of days, a sort of pro-war statement that sent certain ripples through kind of cultural Petersburg and cultural Moscow, and sort of yet another data point in the story that you're describing. Anton, I want to ask you a slightly different story, although in a similar although in a similar vein. And you've been writing in the last couple of weeks about Russian elites at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum in relation to sanctions, in relation to the government. I'm curious how you break it all down. I mean, you sort of mentioned the shell-shocked computer programmers in Istanbul. That's one kind of Russian elite, of course. There's business leaders and people who make money in the system, and then of course there's the very substantial military and intelligence services and the Kremlin itself. All of these are sort of parts and pieces of the Russian elite. But since you've been focusing on this topic, and since it's a very important topic, I'm very curious how you see it, how you conceptualize it, the sort of functioning of not just Putin and the Kremlin, but of the Russian elite writ large at the present moment.
Well, I think even to zoom out even further on this question of the efficacy of sanctions, the Russian middle class clearly has seen some consequence and some change to their standard of living. But one really important point about that Natalia Zubarevich reminded me of recently is that more than half the middle class in Russia is a state employee, state company employee, a silovik. Putin has expanded the state apparatus and the apparatus of his influence so much that the amount of people in not just the elite, but kind of across society that really thinks of themselves as owing their well-being to the state is really extraordinary. So that's kind of one thing you have to think about in terms of the efficacy of sanctions. And in terms of the elites, yes, Josh is right. I mean, clearly there's a new wave of compromise going on, although the compromises that people are making are not, to me, they're not like these old compromises where you kind of pledge allegiance to the state, but still enjoy weekends in Vienna and apartments in London. You still can theoretically, but it's just become much harder. And you do see people like Dmitry Trenin, who I'm sure people listening are familiar with, who straddled the worlds of the Russian and the American political analyst mainstream, and who decided that time of his life was over and that he is now on the Russian side, supporting this war, period, and is no longer interested in speaking to the West. And so I think that this compromise that we're seeing now goes further, and it's accompanied by an attempt to look away. I think as much as trying to rationalize what's happening, it's really an attempt to not want to know what's going on, because as Russian propaganda reminds you, you can't really trust anything anyway. And so yeah, in terms of the elites, look, what is, depending on how you count, 0 to 1 oligarch has spoken out loudly against the war. 1 Russian diplomat has resigned publicly out of the many thousands they have stationed around the world. 1 senior Russian official, resigned, but hasn't even said anything publicly. It shows you the degree to which Putin has built up this this vertical of control, not just the power vertical we hear so much about, but also a vertical in Russian society where so many segments of it are beholden to him. So I'm happy to speak about that in more detail, but that in the grand scheme of things is how I see this situation.
Josh, the question of maybe your own interactions or how you think the kind of truths of the war are being received in Russia. What are your thoughts on that? Oh, Josh, I think you need to unmute yourself.
I'd like to speak to the statistic that Anton raised from Levada Center, about 43%, I believe, of respondents not following the war or not following events in Ukraine. And that actually, to me, feels like the most sort of prescient and illuminating one, because in my own immediate circle, with lots of Russian friends, including lots of Russian friends who ended up in Yerevan, which became a kind of temporary quasi home base for me for much of the spring and summer. I've now left, but spent some months in and out of there between Yerevan and Ukraine. I noticed something like that phenomenon in action, which is in the beginning, the kind of Russian person, perhaps who was in my immediate social world to begin with, or certainly who chose in the early days of the war to end up in Yerevan, seemed to be disproportionately, if not uniformly, against the war or even horrified by the war, and certainly not under any illusions about the nature of the war and the nature of the invasion, and were tended to follow events in Ukraine very closely in those early days. But I noticed over the course of the spring, and as the spring turned into summer, a kind of resigned detachment that came, at least in the people I felt like I was seeing and had access to, not because they were falling victim to Kremlin narratives, propaganda about the war, but simply that they were becoming exhausted by their own powerlessness, maybe even humiliated by their own powerlessness, quietly humiliated, right? Sort of personally and secretly humiliated. And that, the Russian political system, frankly, whether you're in Russia or outside of Russia, there aren't a whole lot of levers, or in fact, maybe there are almost no levers by which a person can influence politics with a capital P, certainly on questions of war and peace. This invasion and the nature of Russia's war in Ukraine is not something that is really subject to public debate. And I struggle to see, how with the Kremlin and Putin personally having walled himself off from Russian society at large, and there aren't just a lot of mechanisms by which the mood on the street influences, policy at the top. It's certainly not on something that is of such central priority to Putin. I think that those Russians who felt powerless were sort of correct ultimately in their diagnosis. Separate question is, what does one do with that feeling of powerlessness? But I certainly noticed a growing sense of fatigue and disengagement, and that there were less conversations about the war, less conversations about Ukraine. Certainly, it's also understandable that whether you're in Russia or abroad, that Russians have, incomparable in relation to the problems of Ukrainians who are being actively bombed and struck with missiles and so on, and killed in shopping centers, as happened yesterday. But still, whether it's through sanctions, economic downturn, fleeing the country, there are all sorts of quotidian problems that Russians are facing, and they seem to have, in some measure or large measure, retreated to solving them rather than to continue to focus on big questions of war and peace. And in the end, that sort of disengagement can be as decisive as support. And I think that, in fact, is the great lesson of Putinism 1999 to January 2022, right? In that what made that system possible was not only sort of what you might call active support for Putin, which I think had really waned in recent years, but it was a kind of disengaged apathy or a disengaged kind of retreat from the political and public sphere. And I fear that same thing is happening again, for reasons that I understand, for reasons that are not kind of foreign or unknowable to me, right? I think I can deduce why this mechanism and habit of thought and action is so embedded in Russian society. There are lots of reasons for it that I understand, but clearly I don't see that cycle being broken, and I only see it being further embedded in Russian life, in which those in fact, first and foremost, perhaps those who think differently or don't share the Kremlin or Putin's policy priorities, not least on the war, don't push the system to be different, but rather disengage from that process entirely.
The wages of disengagement. Well, I like the broad historical sweep going back to 1999, although of course you noted that nothing is predestined from that moment or even from 2007, but the broad historical sweep is a good place, I think, for us to conclude. Let me thank you both, Josh and Anton, for your time, for your extraordinary insight. I'd also like to thank you in a different register just for the journalism that you're doing. It's of the essence. Certainly in the city of Washington it is, but I know for all the readers of your work, it's really it's never been more essential than since the start of this war. Let me conclude as well by thanking the Carnegie Corporation for its support for the Monterey conversations. Anna Vasilyeva in Monterey, Jade McGlynn in London, Darla Margakin in Maine. All of these people help to make these conversations possible. And then very finally for our audience, we have an upcoming conversation about the notion of the free world with Peter Sleskin, Anatol Levin, and Jeff Gedman on Thursday. And next week, something that's very much in tune with the conversation we've had today, a discussion with Daniel Kurtz-Phelan of Foreign Affairs on July 6th about how he's tried to cover the war and think about the war. So I think it will be, from a different vantage point, a very nice addition to all of the great insights that Josh and Anton have brought to our attention today. But most of all, thanks to our two speakers. We hope to have you back beneath the Monterey umbrella at some point in the future. And until then, we'll be very, very avid readers of your work. So take care, keep safe, and until soon, I hope.
Thank you very much.